The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly beneath Lieutenant Jack Morrison's damaged P-40 Warhawk. A vast blue emptiness that offered no mercy to a pilot in trouble. From a distance, his aircraft still looked aggressive and intact. Its shark-mouth nose art cutting through the air with defiance, but inside the cockpit the truth was far darker. The engine no longer purred with confidence. It growled unevenly, coughing every few seconds like a wounded animal refusing to lie down. Fuel pressure flickered dangerously low, oil temperature climbed past safe limits, and the faint metallic smell of burning leaked into Jack's lungs with every breath. He knew his plane was living on borrowed time. Just 20 minutes earlier, Jack had been flying a routine patrol over contested waters near the Solomon Islands. Routine, at least by wartime standards. The sky had been clear, visibility perfect, and his thoughts briefly drifted to how quiet the war could feel when death wasn't actively chasing you. That illusion shattered without warning. A Japanese Zero had come screaming out of the sun, its cannons flashing for only a heartbeat before vanishing again. Jack barely had time to react before the impact ripped through his left wing. The P-40 shuddered violently, alarms blaring as the enemy pilot disappeared, confident the damage would finish the job. Jack survived the attack, but survival didn't mean safety. It meant a slow, terrifying countdown. Now, alone and far from friendly airspace, Jack fought to keep the Warhawk stable. Every movement of the control stick felt heavier than the last, as if the aircraft itself was resisting his attempts to stay alive. His radio was dead, the antenna likely sheared off during the initial strike, leaving him cut off from any hope of assistance. He had no escort, no warning system, and no one to hear his final words if the engine quit. All he could do was fly, pray, and conserve what little strength the P-40 had left. Then he saw them. At first, they were only tiny black dots scattered across the horizon, barely noticeable against the brightness of the sky. Jack's stomach tightened instantly. He didn't need binoculars or radar to know what they were. Experience had taught him that death often announced itself quietly before screaming. As the dots grew larger, their shapes became unmistakable sleek wings, spinning propellers, the deadly elegance of Japanese Mitsubishi Zeros. Not one, not three. 11 fighters spread out in a wide arc, their formation disciplined and deliberate. They had spotted him, and they were moving in with calm confidence. Jack swallowed hard, forcing his breathing to slow. 11 against 1 was suicide under normal circumstances. 11 against 1 with a damaged aircraft was a death sentence. The Japanese pilots clearly believed they were hunting a healthy, isolated American fighter, an easy kill to pad their victory counts. What they didn't know was that Jack's P-40 wasn't a threat, it was a miracle still flying. A miracle held together by stubborn willpower and fading mechanical strength. The Zeros began to circle, climbing above and dipping below, testing his reactions. Jack resisted the urge to maneuver aggressively. Any sharp turn could rip his weakened wing clean off. Instead, he maintained a steady course, pretending confidence, pretending control, hoping to mask the truth. Sweat ran down his spine despite the cold air seeping into the cockpit. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear alone, but from exhaustion. He had already fought the plane for too long. Inside the cockpit, every sound felt amplified. The engine's irregular rhythm hammered into his skull. The rattling of loose metal reminded him how close he was to losing everything. His mind raced through scenarios diving toward the ocean, trying to force an overshoot, maybe even attempting a desperate escape into cloud cover that didn't exist. None of the options offered real hope. The Japanese fighters had altitude, numbers, and speed. Jack had none of those. All he had was experience and a refusal to die quietly. The first Zero made its move. It peeled away from the formation and dove toward him, guns flashing as tracer rounds tore through the air. Jack yanked the control stick gently, narrowly avoiding the burst, but the maneuver sent a painful shudder through the damaged wing. Warning lights screamed in protest. He leveled out quickly, heart pounding, knowing he couldn't afford another mistake like that. Above him, the remaining fighters tightened their formation, emboldened by his limited response. To them, this wasn't a duel, it was a lesson in dominance. As the minutes dragged on, the Zeros attacked in turns, probing his defenses, forcing him lower and lower. Each pass chipped away at his remaining control, and each near miss drained more fuel, more oil, more hope. Jack's throat felt dry, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. Memories flickered through his mind, training flights back home. Instructors barking orders, friends laughing in mess halls, faces of pilots who never came back. He wondered briefly if his name would soon be added to that list. Yet even as despair threatened to take hold, something else stirred inside him. Anger, defiance, a quiet, burning refusal to give these pilots the satisfaction of an easy victory. Jack knew the P-40's strengths better than anyone. It wasn't as agile as a Zero, but it could dive faster, hit harder, and absorb punishment that would tear lighter aircraft apart. If his plane was going to die, it wouldn't be without a fight. He adjusted his altitude slightly, letting the nose dip just enough to build speed without stressing the wing too much. The ocean rushed closer beneath him, its surface glinting like broken glass. The Zeros followed, sensing weakness, eager to finish the hunt. One of them moved into position directly behind him, lining up the perfect shot. Jack could almost feel the enemy pilot's confidence through the air between them. At the last possible second, Jack pushed the Warhawk into a shallow dive. The engine screamed in protest, but the sudden burst of speed caught the pursuing Zero off guard. The Japanese fighter overshot, streaking past in a blur of gray and red markings. Jack seized the moment, squeezing the trigger as his guns roared to life. Tracer rounds tore through the sky, ripping into the enemy aircraft's fuselage. Smoke erupted instantly, and the Zero spiraled downward, vanishing toward the ocean below. It wasn't a victory. It was a warning. The remaining 10 fighters scattered, shocked by the loss. They hadn't expected resistance. Certainly not from a plane they believed was already beaten. Jack's chest heaved as adrenaline surged through his veins. For the first time since the ambush began, he felt a flicker of control return. He was still alive, still dangerous, and now the Japanese pilots knew it. But the cost was immediate. The strain of the maneuver pushed his engine past its limits. The temperature gauge spiked violently, and thick smoke began seeping from beneath the instrument panel. Jack coughed, eyes burning as the realization hit him hard. He had traded time for survival, and time was something he didn't have much of. Above him, the Zeros regrouped, their formation tighter, their movements more cautious. They no longer rushed in carelessly. Now they attacked with discipline, coordinating their passes, forcing Jack to react again and again. Each evasion drained more strength from the failing P-40. His fuel gauge hovered dangerously close to empty, and his vision blurred at the edges from exhaustion and smoke inhalation. Still, Jack fought on. Minutes stretched into an eternity of gunfire, engine screams, and near-death escapes. The sky that had once seemed endless now felt like a cage closing in. With every breath, Jack knew the inevitable was approaching. Either the engine would fail, the wing would tear away, or the Zeros would finally land the killing blow. He didn't know which would come first, but he knew the battle was far from over. As another wave of fighters dove toward him, Jack steadied his grip, eyes locked forward, jaw set with determination. If this was going to be his final stand, he would make it one they would never forget. Jack Morrison returned to consciousness in fragments. Pain came first, sharp and overwhelming, radiating through his skull and down his spine. The smell of smoke and burning fuel filled his lungs, forcing him to cough violently. Sand pressed against his face, gritty and hot, and somewhere nearby metal crackled as flames consumed what remained of his P-40 Warhawk. For a brief, terrifying moment, he thought he was still falling, still trapped in the sky, but then reality settled in. He was alive. Barely. He forced his eyes open and immediately regretted it. The world spun violently, colors blurring together as his vision struggled to focus. His head throbbed, and his legs screamed with pain when he tried to move it. Blood soaked through his flight suit, sticky and warm, and every breath felt like dragging fire into his chest. The crash had not killed him, but it had left him broken, vulnerable, and stranded on an island he knew nothing about. Instinct took over. Jack unbuckled himself slowly, gritting his teeth as pain flared with every movement. He crawled away from the burning wreckage just as the flames reached the remaining fuel. The explosion that followed sent a shock wave through the beach, throwing sand into the air and confirming what he already knew: the Warhawk was gone. His only way home had died in the crash. He lay there for several seconds, staring at the sky through the gaps in the jungle canopy, forcing himself to breathe. The Zeros were gone. They had circled, watched the crash, and left. To them, this story was over. Another American pilot dead, another victory claimed. Jack almost laughed at the irony. They had hunted him for hours, fired thousands of rounds, and in the end, it was gravity that brought him down. But gravity hadn't finished the job. The jungle around him was alive with sound. Insects buzzed relentlessly, birds screeched overhead, and something deeper in the trees moved with heavy steps. Jack's training screamed at him that this was enemy territory. The Pacific Islands were littered with Japanese outposts, hidden airstrips, and patrols that hunted survivors without mercy. If he stayed on the beach, he would be found. And if he was found, wounded and alone, he would not be taken prisoner. He forced himself upright, leaning against a palm tree for support. His leg nearly gave out beneath him, and he cried out despite his effort to stay silent. The pain was blinding, but fear pushed him forward. He tore strips of fabric from his flight suit and wrapped them tightly around his thigh, biting down hard as he cinched the makeshift bandage. Blood seeped through, but it slowed. It would have to be enough. Using the last of his strength, Jack dragged himself into the jungle. Every step was agony. Sharp leaves cut into his skin and branches tore at his clothing. Sweat mixed with blood, and his vision swam as dehydration and exhaustion set in. He had no food, no water, no weapon, only a small survival knife still strapped to his belt. The sounds of the jungle seemed louder now, closer, as if the island itself was aware of his presence. He collapsed beneath the cluster of thick foliage, forcing himself to stay still. Time lost meaning. Minutes blurred into hours as he drifted in and out of consciousness. Each time he woke, he expected to see Japanese soldiers standing over him. Each time, there was only jungle, but he knew his luck would not last forever. Sometime later, he couldn't tell how long voices reached his ears. They were speaking Japanese. Jack's heart hammered in his chest as he pressed himself deeper into the undergrowth. Through the leaves, he saw movement. 3 soldiers emerged from the trees, rifles slung across their shoulders, scanning the ground carefully. Their uniforms were dusty, their expressions serious. These were not rescuers, they were hunters. One of them gestured toward the beach, speaking rapidly. Another nodded and pointed inland. They were searching for him. Jack barely dared to breathe. His leg throbbed relentlessly, and sweat ran into his eyes, threatening to give him away. He clutched his knife, knowing how useless it would be against rifles. If they found him, there would be no fight, only an ending. The soldiers moved closer, their boots crunching softly against leaves and dirt. Jack's mind raced. He thought of surrendering, of stepping out and raising his hands, but stories flooded his memory, stories of pilots executed on the spot, of mercy that never came. He stayed still, praying the jungle would hide him. A soldier passed so close Jack could smell the sweat on his uniform. Another stopped, frowning, and pointed at the ground. Jack's blood froze. They had found tracks. The third soldier raised his rifle, shouting something Jack didn't understand. Panic surged through him. Without thinking, Jack hurled a rock into the bush to his left. It crashed through the leaves, loud and deliberate. The soldiers reacted instantly. 2 of them swung their rifles toward the sound, shouting as they advanced. The third followed, leaving Jack's hiding place unexamined. The distraction worked. Jack didn't wait. He crawled deeper into the jungle, ignoring the pain, ignoring the blood, driven purely by survival. He moved until his body could no longer obey him, then collapsed beside a shallow stream. He drank greedily, muddy water spilling down his chin, not caring about sickness or consequences. Water meant life. For now. Night fell quickly. The jungle transformed after sunset. Sounds multiplied, shadows stretched, and fear pressed in from every direction. Jack shivered uncontrollably, fever setting in as infection threatened his wounds. He knew he couldn't survive like this much longer. If the Japanese didn't find him, the island itself would kill him. Then faintly, he heard something that made his breath catch. Aircraft engines. Not Zeros. These engines sounded different, deeper, heavier, American. Jack forced himself to his feet and stumbled toward a small clearing near the stream. Using his knife, he scraped together dry leaves and branches, stacking them into a rough pile. His hands shook violently as he struck sparks again and again until finally flames caught. He fed the fire desperately, watching smoke rise into the night sky. Moments later, gunfire erupted in the jungle behind him. The Japanese soldiers had heard the engine too, and they knew what the smoke meant. Bullets tore through the trees, splintering wood and sending leaves raining down. Jack dove behind a fallen log as rounds slammed into the ground around him. He could hear shouting, boots pounding closer. They were coming fast now, determined to finish him before rescue arrived. Jack clutched his knife, heart racing, knowing this would be the end. Then the sky roared. Machine guns thundered overhead as American fighters swept low across the jungle, their tracers ripping through the darkness. Explosions followed as ground troops returned fire. The island erupted into chaos. The Japanese soldiers scattered, firing wildly before retreating into the trees. Jack lay there, stunned, as flares lit the clearing in harsh white light. Moments later, American voices shouted his name. Strong hands grabbed him, lifting him onto a stretcher. Medics worked quickly, cutting away his flight suit, applying pressure to his wounds. As they carried him toward the beach, Jack looked up at the sky one last time, stars shining peacefully above the violence. He had survived. Days later, aboard a hospital ship, Jack learned the truth. His radio silence and last known position had triggered a search. Pilots had spotted smoke rising from the island and moved in, expecting wreckage, not a living man. His story spread quickly through the squadrons. A lone P-40, 11 Japanese fighters, a damaged plane, a pilot who refused to die. Jack never flew combat missions again. His injuries ended his flying career, but not his service. He became an instructor, teaching young pilots how to survive when everything went wrong. And every time he spoke, he told them the same thing. The plane doesn't decide when you die, he said. You do. The moment Jack Morrison shot down the first Japanese Zero, the nature of the fight changed completely. What had begun as a confident hunt turned into something far more dangerous, a calculated execution attempt by pilots who now knew their prey could still bite back. The 10 remaining fighters no longer played with him. They moved with precision, spreading out in a wide killing net that gave him no clear escape route. Each Zero was positioned to cover another, their formation designed to trap him no matter which direction he turned. He knew he was running out of options. His fuel was nearly gone, his engine overheating, and the ocean below offered no place to land, only a slow, freezing death if he bailed out. He thought about his family back home, the letters he had written but never mailed, the promise he had made to himself that he would survive the war. Those thoughts threatened to weaken him, but he pushed them aside. Sentiment had no place in the sky. Another Zero dove toward him from above, its guns blazing. Jack pulled the stick gently, trying to avoid overstressing the damaged wing. But the plane responded sluggishly. It was a dangerous gamble, but he knew the P-40 could take more punishment than their lightweight Zeros. One pilot took the bait. The Zero came in fast and low, lining up behind him for what looked like a guaranteed kill. Jack waited until the last second, his heart pounding so loudly he could hear it over the engine. Then he rolled the Warhawk into a sudden barrel roll, ignoring the screaming protests of the damaged wing. The maneuver was sloppy, imperfect, but it worked. The Zero overshot again and Jack fired another burst. This time he didn't see the result. He was too busy fighting to keep his own aircraft from tearing itself apart. The engine sputtered violently, coughing thick black smoke into the cockpit. His vision blurred and he felt lightheaded. He realized he had been breathing smoke for too long. Every breath felt like inhaling fire. His hands shook, his movements slower now, less precise. The Warhawk was dying, and so was he if this continued. The Zeros regrouped once more, circling him like vultures over a wounded animal. They had lost 2 pilots now, and that loss had hardened their resolve. He struggled to see, wiping his goggles with shaking hands. The heat was unbearable, and panic clawed at his chest. He knew what fire meant in an aircraft. Fire meant seconds. He reached for the emergency extinguisher and released it into the engine compartment. Watching as the flames diminished but did not completely die, the damage was severe. Oil sprayed across the windshield, blinding him further. He had to rely on instinct, muscle memory, and sheer stubbornness to keep flying. In the chaos, Jack felt a sudden jolt of pain in his leg. The P-40 screamed as it cut through the air, faster than the Zeros could comfortably follow. This was the Warhawk's advantage speed in a dive. 2 Zeros broke off, unwilling to risk structural failure. But one pilot stayed with him, determined to finish the job. Jack knew this was his chance. As they neared the water, he pulled up hard, the damaged wing creaking dangerously. The Zero behind him tried to follow, but misjudged the maneuver. The Japanese fighter slammed into the ocean in a violent explosion of water and debris. Jack didn't celebrate. He didn't even feel relief. He felt only exhaustion and dread. He had lost count of how long the battle had lasted. Minutes felt like hours. His fuel was critically low, his engine barely functioning, and his body weakening from blood loss and smoke. He realized he could not win this fight through skill alone. He needed a miracle. The remaining 7 Zeros stayed high, circling, waiting for him to make the next mistake. They had learned his tricks. They knew he relied on diving and sudden maneuvers. Now they would force him to burn fuel, to tire himself out, to make a fatal error. Jack glanced at his fuel gauge. The needle hovered just above empty. He had perhaps 5 minutes of flight left. Desperation crept into his thoughts. He considered ditching the plane and parachuting into the ocean, but he knew the chances of survival were slim. Sharks, exposure, and enemy patrols would finish what the fighter started. Staying in the air even in a dying aircraft was still his best chance. Then, in the distance, he saw something that made his heart jump, a faint outline of land. A small island. He didn't know if it was friendly or enemy-controlled, but it didn't matter. Land meant hope. Land meant somewhere to crash that wasn't water. He angled the Warhawk toward it, praying the engine would hold together just a little longer. The Zeros saw his move immediately. They descended, forming a barrier between him and the island. They knew what he was trying to do, and they would not allow it. The fight was no longer just about shooting him down. It was about preventing his escape. Jack clenched his jaw and pushed the throttle forward, even though he knew it was pointless. The engine sputtered, coughing violently. Flames flared again beneath the cowling. The cockpit filled with smoke so thick he could barely see the instruments. He thought about giving up. He thought about letting go. But something inside him refused. He remembered his training instructor's words. A fighter pilot's job is not to die heroically. It's to survive long enough to fight again. That thought anchored him. He didn't need to be a hero. He just needed to stay alive. As the island grew closer, the Zeros attacked again, forcing him lower and lower. Bullets tore through the wings, shredding metal. A round smashed through the canopy, missing his head by inches. He felt the air rip through the cockpit, cold and violent. Finally, the engine gave one last violent shudder. Then it went silent. The sudden quiet was terrifying. The propeller slowed, the Warhawk losing power, gliding helplessly toward the island. Jack felt weightless, the control stick loose in his hand. The Zeros circled above him, unsure whether to finish him or let gravity do the work. He guided the powerless aircraft as best he could, aiming for a flat stretch of beach visible below. Darkness swallowed him. Above, the Japanese fighters circled once more, watching the wreckage burn. They assumed he was dead. They were wrong.